Ukraine's relations with its neighbors have always been intense and sometimes complicated. This is the reality of historical processes involving those who care about their past, let alone their future. Political and social circles, diplomatic games, business or even personal interests have been influencing relations between both countries and their citizens for centuries. This is the Ukraine Neighbors Points of Contact podcast, and here we are looking for commonalities in the relations between us and our neighboring countries. Ukraine-Hungary commonalities.
In the previous episode, we focused on the Hungarian government's global interests and their impact on relations with its neighbors, as well as on Hungary's state information policy, which is reflected in its relations with Ukraine. Next, let us talk about the commonalities that are the foundation of good neighborly relations. We have already mentioned the similarities in the history of both countries. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Moscow destroyed Budapest and killed thousands of Hungarians under the guise of fighting the Nazis. 200,000 people were forced to flee the country. The Hungarians hoped for the support of the West, but it had other priorities. Does it remind you of anything in the current history of Ukraine? No matter how close the ties of the current Hungarian leadership with Russia are, public views and the influence of historic memory on them should be separated from it, says Pavlo Klimkin, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2014-2019.
First of all, what is Hungarian society? It is also divided and fragmented. If you talk to people in Budapest, where the opposition plays a very important role, if not a dominant one, it is one story. If you talk to people in other big cities, it is another story. If you talk to people in villages, it is a different story too. And in fact, Orban's key audience is not in big cities, but in small towns, so it is indeed very difficult to talk about Hungarian society and its dominant attitude. And when we talk about Hungary, we have our own difficulties, but Hungary is not dominantly pro-Russian. As we already mentioned, the majority of the population there does not have any sympathy for the Kremlin, for Putin, and so on.
The common historical memory, in fact, serves as a foundation on which good neighborly relations are built, despite the challenges. And the relations between Ukraine and Hungary are not exception, emphasized Vitaly Jachuk, an analyst at the Institute for Central European Strategy and the Reopen Ukraine project.
We have a common historical memory. We all know what a common enemy is, who captured and destroyed our lands. It was there before and is here now. It is just that this enemy has returned under a different guise and threatens not only to destroy Ukraine, but also has plans for other states. And this has been said many times, if not openly, then wildly. And our neighbors are probably also aware of this. However, not completely. And then we already see our relations changing towards pragmatism.
Pragmatism is what is at the forefront of Hungary's relations with the EU. The Ukrainian issue often becomes a subject of bargaining for the Hungarian authorities for better conditions for themselves. However, when the country crosses the line, the EU imposed sanctions, as for example in July of this year when the European Union deprived Hungary of the right to host a meeting of foreign and defense ministers in protest of Viktor Orban's meeting with the Russian dictator. But despite the Hungarian government's strong public statements about the inexpendency of funding for Ukraine from the European Union when it comes down to it, for example, as in the case of starting negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU, Prime Minister Viktor Orban just walks out of the room, allowing a positive decision to be made without his participation. As for Ukraine's pragmatism in its relations with Hungary and with its other closest neighbors, it is measured most of all by common economic interests. Among other things, the point of contact is the energy sector, Vitaly Dechuk says.
Our neighbors are also interested in developing their economies, and the war, no matter how unfortunate it may sound, is an important incentive for economic development. Because it attracts new labor, it attracts investment in the defense sector. Our neighbors are interested in the stability of Ukraine because we have a common dependence on the stability of the same energy resources. Ukraine is a transit country. Ukraine uses reverse flows, including gas, and receives electricity from those countries, which means money for the budget of those countries, and in return they receive transit from us, on which they are quite dependent, in particular Hungary, Slovakia or the Czech Republic. That is, these are complex long-term relations. Moreover, the governments of these countries are also interested in the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, because it attracts large investments and inflows of funds to their budgets as well.
Diplomat Pavlo Klimkin also emphasizes the common historical memory and economic interest for both Ukrainians and Hungarians. He also emphasizes on the same European vector of movement for the states without creating obstacles for each other.
The first is the European dimension. I want Hungary not to block or hinder our European integration path, and not to block the opening of new opportunities in the negotiations. And Hungary needs EU money. Orban cannot do without it, neither now nor in the future. And here we have a leverage in Brussels, the ability to influence EU policy. The second is bilateral economic cooperation. Hungarian business in Ukraine. In the future, it might be economic recovery. And now it is regional economy, including Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia, including the possibility of infrastructure projects, including the possibility of system projects. For example, the well-known Hungarian company MOL is quite controversial in Ukraine because it receives oil from Russia and it would like to enter Ukraine. And it will be a rather emotional political discussion on this issue in Ukraine. And the third, of course, is Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia. That is, we have enough points of contact to talk about, and I do not really see that we cannot use these points of contact. And as for me, there will always be some emotional component in our relations, and this is beneficial for Orban. For us, it is quite difficult to give it up. But we understand perfectly well what our Hungarians are doing for us, for our safety, for our independence. They are also serving in the army, they are also serving in the defense forces, and this is very, very important. Because no matter how much we talk about dual citizenship, issuing passports and so on, now this is an emotional point about people who risk and give their lives for the independence of Ukraine as such. Future.
The support for the ordinary Hungarian population for the defense forces of Ukraine and the service of Hungarians in the Ukrainian army is one of the factors that is already affecting positive changes in relations between societies on both sides of the border and will have the greatest impact in the future. Pavlo Klimkin is convinced. And if we also assume changes in the Hungarian domestic political stage that will bring to power forces which are less loyal to Russia, this will only be beneficial for the Ukrainian-Hungarian good neighborless.
Domestic policy is changing there. There is a new and quite popular politician from the right wing, Peter Magyar, who accuses Orban of corruption, inefficiency, and this politician is not from the left, but from the right. And Orban has this trap of being caught between the left and right wings. This is something that is happening a lot in Europe and in other countries.
В Європі, по інших країнах.
One cannot predict how and when the domestic political situation in Hungary will change. However, what analysts can predict for sure is changes in the broadcasts of pro-Russian propaganda. Dorka Takachi, a researcher at the Center for the Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy in Hungary, hopes that such changes will come and that Hungarians will start learning more about Ukraine and Ukrainians throughout the media.
If and when there will be a political change, with a different propaganda, we can change it. Because why it worked well was because Hungarian society knew very little about Ukraine and about Ukrainian people at all, about the whole situation. So this void was very easy to fill with all these terrible lies. Society knew very little about Ukraine and about Ukrainian people at all, about the whole situation. So this void was very easy to fill with all these terrible lies. So they managed to fill it. But given that it worked so well this way, I'm convinced that once, if there will be political will, we can change it just as well.
Seeking understanding and not hitting sore spots is an important skill for those who are responsible neighbors. This is the Ukraine Neighbors Points of Contact podcast, a project to find commonalities in Ukraine's relations with its neighboring countries. The podcast was created with the financial and organizational support of the Gайнріха Bьолля Foundation, Kyiv office, Ukraine.